The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of a mansion that sat high above the city. Inside, everything sparkled. The marble floors, the gold frames, even the silence. It was the kind of house that looked perfect from the outside. But inside it carried the weight of pride, tension, and fear. The man who owned it all was known for his wealth and his power. He ran one of the biggest companies in the city, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Everyone respected him, or at least they pretended to. He was the kind of man people smiled at in public but avoided when they could. His words were sharp and his temper even sharper. In the mansion, the staff worked quietly, careful not to make mistakes. They knew that one wrong move could bring a storm. Among them was Grace, a calm and humble woman who had worked for the family for over 15 years. She wasn't loud, she wasn't proud. She simply did her job with quiet grace, caring for the family's needs like it was her own home. But for the man she served, she was invisible. That morning, Grace walked into the living room carrying a tray with his breakfast. He was already sitting there, reading the newspaper and talking on the phone. His voice filled the room, confident, impatient, full of control. Grace placed the tray down carefully on the table, making sure not to disturb him. But as she turned to leave, his voice cut through the air. "Is this how you serve food in this house?" he snapped without even looking at her. Grace froze, confused. She had done everything the same way she always did. He slammed his hand on the table, spilling a bit of his coffee. "I said no sugar in my coffee. Do you even listen?" Grace looked down. "I'm sorry, sir. I must have misunderstood. I'll make another one right away." But her calmness only fueled his anger. "You misunderstand too much for someone who's been here for years. I don't pay people to make mistakes." His voice grew louder. The staff in the hallway stood still, afraid to move. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "I'm truly sorry, sir. It won't happen again." He leaned back and let out a short, cruel laugh. "You're lucky to even have this job. People like you don't get chances like this often." His words cut deeper than he realized. Grace's eyes lowered, but she said nothing. After a moment, she quietly picked up the tray and walked away. As she reached the kitchen, one of the younger maids whispered, "Why do you let him talk to you like that?" Grace gave a faint smile. "Because anger doesn't change the truth," she said softly. "People show who they are when they think no one can touch them." Later that morning, the businessman stood in his office looking out the window at the city below. The skyline seemed to belong to him. The cars, the lights, the people rushing, all part of the empire he had built. He felt powerful, untouchable. Today was supposed to be a big day. A $330 million merger was about to be signed. It would make him even richer, more respected, more feared. He fixed his tie in the mirror, admiring his reflection. To him, life was about winning, and he had been winning for years. But in chasing power, he had forgotten how to see people. Even those who stood beside him were only tools for his success. Before leaving for the meeting, he passed through the living room again. Grace was dusting the shelves quietly. He stopped, watching her for a second. "Make sure the house is spotless when I return," he said sharply. "We'll have guests for dinner. Important ones." "Yes, sir," she replied politely. He studied her face for a moment. There was something calm about her that annoyed him. She wasn't afraid enough, not like the others. "You know," he said suddenly, "you should be grateful. Not everyone gets to live in a house like this. I could replace you tomorrow and no one would notice." Grace looked at him, her eyes kind but firm. "Sir," she said softly, "everything we have can be taken in a moment. It's not the walls or the money that make a home. It's how you treat people in it." He frowned, not expecting a response. "Save your lectures for someone who cares," he muttered, and walked out. The rest of the morning went on quietly. Grace went about her chores, cleaning, cooking, making sure everything was ready. Despite how he treated her, she never complained. There was something steady in her spirit, a peace that didn't depend on others. The other staff often came to her for comfort or advice. She had a way of calming everyone, even when things went wrong. By noon, the mansion was silent again. The businessman had gone to his office for the big deal that would soon make headlines. Grace took a moment to check on his father, an elderly man who lived in the east wing of the house. Unlike his son, the old man was gentle. He spent his days in a wheelchair, often looking out at the garden with a quiet smile. When Grace entered, he smiled. "Ah, there you are. I was wondering when you'd come." I was just finishing the morning chores, she said, setting a cup of tea on the table beside him. He nodded. You work too hard. Has my son been troubling you again? Grace smiled faintly. He's just under pressure. It's a big day for him. The old man sighed. Pressure doesn't excuse pride. I warned him years ago. Money can build walls, but it can also trap a man inside them. Grace sat beside him quietly. She knew the truth of his words. The family had once been kind and united when his late wife was alive. But since her passing, the house had grown cold. The son had taken control of the company, and with each success, he seemed to lose a piece of himself. You know, the old man said after a pause, you've been with this family longer than most people stay in a lifetime. You've seen it all. Yet you never let bitterness touch your heart. How do you do it? Grace looked out at the sunlight spilling through the window. I try to remember that everyone's fighting a battle we can't see. Some people fight with anger, others with silence. I just choose peace. The old man nodded slowly. You have more wisdom than most of us ever will. That afternoon, the businessman returned from his meeting with a victorious smile. The deal had gone through. His company was now worth more than ever. The news spread fast. His picture flashed on business channels, his name trending across social media. To him, this was proof that he was untouchable. He walked into the house full of confidence, his voice echoing across the marble floors. Open a bottle of champagne? He shouted. We're celebrating tonight. The staff rushed to prepare everything. Grace quietly set the table as laughter and loud voices filled the air. During dinner, the businessman bragged about his success to his guests. It's all about control, he said proudly. You keep people in their place, and the world stays in order. One of his guests laughed and added, You're ruthless. My friend, that's why you win. Grace entered with a dish and placed it gently on the table. He looked at her with that same mocking smile. Ah, here's the one person in this house who doesn't understand winning, he said. The guests chuckled politely. Grace kept her composure, but the old man sitting nearby frowned deeply. After the guests left and the laughter faded, the mansion grew quiet again. Grace was clearing the table when the old man called her. Go rest, he said kindly. You've done enough for today, she nodded. Thank you, sir. Before she left, she saw the businessman sitting by the window with a glass of wine in his hand, staring out at the city lights. He looked proud, yet strangely empty. For a moment, she wanted to say something, to remind him that power doesn't last forever, but she stayed silent. Some lessons she knew, life teaches on its own. As she walked toward her small room at the back of the house, she whispered to herself, Life has a way of humbling the proud. That night, while the city slept, the businessman's world began to shake in ways he could never have imagined. But for now, he slept peacefully, believing his empire was stronger than ever, never realizing that by morning, everything he built would begin to fall apart. The next morning began like any other, with the city waking up to the rush of cars and the hum of ambition. In the mansion, the air was quiet but tense. Grace was already up before sunrise, preparing breakfast and making sure the place looked perfect. She worked with the same patience as always, though the previous day's harsh words still echoed in her mind, but she didn't let them stay long. She had learned over the years that carrying pain only makes the load heavier. Upstairs, the businessman woke to the sound of his phone buzzing nonstop. Dozens of messages from his board members, assistants, and investors filled the screen. Today was a big day for his company. The final step of the $330 million merger was happening. It was supposed to be the deal that would seal his legacy. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his expensive suit. His reflection stared back at him, confident, polished, successful. He smiled to himself, thinking about how far he had come. He believed he had built everything through his own hard work and cleverness. What he didn't realize was that in chasing greatness, he had left behind gratitude. When he came downstairs, Grace was setting the breakfast table. He didn't greet her, only glanced at the food. About time, he muttered. She quietly poured his coffee and stepped back. He sipped it, then gave a short nod of approval. You got it right today, he said dryly, as if giving her a medal. Thank you, sir, she replied softly. He opened his laptop at the table, talking to someone on a video call. Yes, everything's in place. The contracts will be signed by noon. Once this deal is public, we'll be on top of the industry. His voice was filled with pride. Every word sounded like victory. Grace left him to his work and moved quietly through the rooms, polishing the glass windows and checking on the old man in the east wing. The elder was sitting by the window, a blanket over his lap, watching the garden come alive with morning light. "Good morning," she greeted gently. "Good morning, my dear," he replied with a smile. "How's the house today?" "Same as always," she said. "Busy but quiet," he sighed. "And my son?" "He's focused on his business meeting," she said carefully. The old man nodded, a trace of sadness in his eyes. "He thinks success means being feared. But fear is a weak foundation. It collapses when love is gone." Grace said nothing. She only tucked the blanket tighter around him and went to fetch his tea. She had heard him speak about his son many times, but she never added her own opinion. She believed that sometimes silence says more than words. By late morning, the businessman left for his office. The house grew quiet again. Grace used the time to check on every corner, making sure it was spotless for the dinner that evening. The staff worked together under her calm guidance. Though she was not the head of the house, everyone listened to her. She had a natural authority that came from kindness. At the company's headquarters, the businessman's team was already waiting when he arrived. Reporters stood outside the building, cameras flashing. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Everyone wanted to be part of the history he was making. As the boardroom filled with suits and smiles, he took his seat at the head of the table. The lawyers passed around the final documents. His signature would make the deal official. He looked around, proud and satisfied. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is just the beginning. We're building something that will outlast all of us." Then he signed the papers with a flourish. Applause filled the room. Back at the mansion, Grace prepared the dining room for the evening celebration. She arranged the silverware perfectly, set out the fine dishes, and placed flowers at the center of the table. Every detail mattered to her. She didn't work for praise. She worked because it was her nature to give her best. In the afternoon, the old man asked her to sit for a while. "You've been running around all day. Rest a little," he said. Grace smiled and sat beside him. "I'm all right, sir. I like keeping busy." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You've stayed loyal to this family for so many years. Most people would have left." "I gave my word to your late wife," Grace said quietly. "She treated me with kindness when no one else would. I promised her I would look after the home." The old man's eyes softened. "She always said you were a blessing. My son doesn't see it, but one day he will." Grace smiled gently but didn't respond. She had learned not to expect change too quickly. Some lessons take a long time to reach the heart. At the office, things were still going perfectly, or so it seemed. The businessman walked through the halls like a king, shaking hands, giving orders, accepting congratulations. Everyone wanted to be near him. But as the day went on, strange things started to happen. First, his assistant rushed into the room, pale-faced. "Sir, the company's servers went down for a few minutes. Our IT team is working on it," he frowned. "Then fix it. Don't bring me problems, bring me results." "Yes, sir." The assistant ran off nervously. A few minutes later, his phone started buzzing again. Messages poured in, emails, alerts, calls. Something about leaked documents, online rumors, data breaches. He brushed it off at first, thinking it was just noise. But then one of his board members called in a panic. "Have you seen the news?" The voice shouted through the phone. "Our financial records are out. There's an investigation starting." The businessman froze. "That's impossible. We have security." It's everywhere," the man interrupted. "The stock is dropping fast." He opened his laptop and felt his chest tighten. Every news site had his company's name splashed across the headlines. Accusations of insider trading. Questions about hidden accounts. Investors pulling out. Within minutes, his empire began to shake. He stood up, his heart pounding. "Who did this?" he shouted. His team rushed in, trying to calm him down. But the numbers on the screen kept falling, red arrows pointing down. By evening, the company had lost nearly half its value. The deal he celebrated just hours ago was already under review. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some of his business partners stopped answering. Others sent cold messages, distancing themselves. He drove home in silence, his thoughts spinning. The city lights blurred past the window, but he saw none of it. All he could think was how everything he built was slipping away in one single day. When he reached the mansion, Grace met him at the door. "Good evening, sir." "Dinner is ready," she said softly. He didn't respond. He walked past her, heading straight to his office. The staff exchanged worried looks. They could feel the storm coming. In his office, he threw his jacket on the chair and opened his laptop again. The situation had only worsened. Reporters were camped outside his company. The government had announced a formal investigation. His pride, his name, his empire, everything was now at risk. Grace knocked lightly on the door. "Sir, would you like me to bring your dinner here?" He turned sharply. "No."
"Leave me alone!"
His voice echoed down the hallway. Grace didn't flinch. She simply nodded and stepped back. Later that night, he sat in the dark, his face lit only by the glow of the computer screen. The headlines kept updating every few minutes. He felt anger, disbelief, fear, all crashing into each other. From the hallway, the old man's voice called weakly, "What's happening, son?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he shouted back, though his voice cracked slightly. Grace went to check on the old man. She found him looking troubled. "He's shouting again, isn't he?" She nodded gently. "He's under a lot of pressure," the old man sighed deeply. "He still thinks he's in control, but life doesn't ask for permission to teach lessons." She nodded again, knowing he was right. By midnight, the mansion was silent. Grace sat by the kitchen window, sipping tea and staring out at the moonlight. She didn't know all the details, but she could feel something heavy in the air, something changing. Upstairs, the businessman stared at the same sky from his office window. The city that once looked like his playground now felt like a stranger. His phone buzzed again, another message from an investor pulling out. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. As the night went on, he sat there alone, the echo of Grace's words from that morning playing in his mind. "Everything we have can be taken in a moment." He hadn't believed it then, but now he couldn't deny it. The next day started with tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The businessman barely slept. His eyes were tired, his mind restless. He had spent the whole night trying to fix what had gone wrong, but nothing made sense. The more he tried to control the situation, the worse it got. By morning, news outlets were reporting that the government had frozen his company's accounts until further notice. The empire he had built was now on the edge of collapse. In the mansion, Grace moved quietly through the hallways, doing her work as usual. She didn't speak much that morning. She could feel the weight of worry in the air. Even the younger staff whispered among themselves, wondering what was happening. Grace simply told them to stay calm and keep doing their jobs. "Trouble never lasts forever," she said softly, "but how we act during it shows who we are." Around noon, the businessman stormed into the house. His tie was loose, his face pale. He looked like a man who had run out of strength but refused to admit it. Grace was cleaning near the staircase when he entered. He barely noticed her. He threw his phone onto the couch and began pacing back and forth. "How could this happen?" he muttered to himself. "After everything I've done, after all I've built? It can't just disappear overnight." His voice cracked, a mix of anger and disbelief. Grace turned quietly, watching him from a distance. She wanted to help, to say something comforting, but she knew her words wouldn't be welcome yet. A few minutes later, his lawyer arrived. They spoke in the study for almost an hour. When the lawyer left, the businessman looked worse. The company was officially under investigation. Some of his partners had already backed out of their deals. Employees were quitting. It was as if the world had turned against him overnight. He sat on the couch, running his hands over his face. "They're treating me like a criminal," he said under his breath, "after everything I gave them." From the kitchen doorway, Grace heard him. She stepped forward gently. "Would you like some tea, sir?" she asked in her calm voice. He looked up sharply, his frustration boiling over. "Tea? You think tea will fix this mess?" he shouted. "Just do your job and stay out of things you don't understand." The words hit the air hard. Grace didn't respond. She lowered her eyes and nodded, stepping back silently. Moments later, she still brought the tea and set it on the table beside him without saying a word. Then she left the room. He stared at the cup for a long time. The warmth of the steam felt strange in the middle of all that chaos. Deep down, he knew she didn't deserve his anger, but pride wouldn't let him admit it. That afternoon, things only got worse. The news showed images of his office building surrounded by reporters. Employees protested outside, demanding their unpaid salaries. Social media turned on him completely, painting him as the villain of a scandal he didn't even fully understand. His phone buzzed nonstop, but he stopped answering calls. Every ring was another reminder of how fast everything was falling apart. By evening, the mansion that once echoed with pride was filled with silence. Even the light seemed dimmer. Grace went to check on the old man in the east wing. He was sitting quietly listening to the radio. The news was on, and even he had heard about his son's downfall. He turned off the radio as she entered. "I was hoping it wasn't true," he said quietly. Grace set a plate of food on the table beside him. "It's been a hard day," she said. "He's struggling to understand what's happening." The old man sighed. He built his world on power. Power is loud when you have it, but it disappears faster than silence. Grace sat beside him. "He's not a bad man, sir," she said gently. "He's just lost sight of what matters." The old man nodded. "Maybe losing everything will help him find himself again." A few hours later, the businessman came upstairs. He looked exhausted, his clothes wrinkled, his expression empty. He pushed open his father's door without knocking. "You heard the news, didn't you?" he said bitterly. The old man nodded slowly. "I did. They're blaming me for everything. Investors, partners, even my own employees. They've all turned their backs on me." His voice trembled with anger and disbelief. His father looked at him calmly. "You turned your back on something long before they turned theirs. What's that supposed to mean?" He snapped. "On humility," his father said softly. "On kindness. On people." The businessman's face hardened. "You think kindness builds companies?" "No, father. Power does. Strategy does. That's how I kept us at the top." His father looked at him sadly. "And where has that brought you now?" For a moment there was silence. The question hung in the air. The businessman wanted to argue, but he had no answer. His father reached out a weak hand. "Sit down," he said. Reluctantly, the son sat beside him. His father's eyes softened. "Do you remember what your mother used to say? A home without compassion is just a house full of furniture. This mansion, your company, your money, they were never meant to replace love. You pushed people away, even those who tried to help you." The businessman looked down, his hands clenched. "I did what I had to do." His father shook his head. "No, son. You did what your pride told you to do." Just then, Grace entered quietly with a tray of soup. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I thought you both might need something warm." The businessman glared at her, his pride still raw. "I don't need your pity," he said harshly. His father's voice rose slightly. "That's enough." The businessman froze. He hadn't heard his father speak so firmly in years. The old man looked at Grace with respect. "You've done more for this family than any of us have. You've kept this home alive when it should have fallen apart. Don't let his anger change who you are." Grace nodded silently and placed the tray on the table. Then she turned to leave, but before stepping out, she said in her calm voice, "Sir, I don't pity you. I just hope one day you'll see that strength isn't about control, it's about heart." Then she left the room. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the businessman stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I can't listen to this right now," he said, and walked out. The old man sighed deeply. He's blind to the truth, but life has a way of opening eyes. That night, the mansion was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Grace checked that everything was locked and in order before heading to her small room. But before she could rest, she heard a crash from upstairs. She hurried to the sound and found the businessman sitting on the floor in his office, surrounded by papers. His laptop screen glowed with more bad news. The company's accounts were officially frozen and he had lost almost everything. He looked up at her, his eyes red. "It's over," he said in a hollow voice. "Everything I built is gone." Grace didn't move closer, but her voice was gentle. "Maybe it's not the end, sir. Maybe it's just the start of something different." He let out a bitter laugh. "Different? I've lost everything. The business, the respect, the people. No one's answering my calls." Grace looked at him quietly. Maybe that's because it's time to listen instead of speak. Her words hit deeper than he expected. He looked at her confused, almost angry, but she didn't explain. She simply turned and left, leaving him to sit in silence. He stared out the window again, watching the rain fall. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt small. All his success, his pride, his empire, it had vanished faster than he could understand. And in that quiet moment, he began to see what he had refused to see before. Down the hall, Grace whispered a quiet prayer for peace, not just for him, but for everyone in the house. She knew that sometimes losing everything is the only way a person can finally learn what truly matters. Days passed, and the once powerful businessman found himself surrounded by silence. The grand halls of his mansion that used to echo with music and laughter were now empty. His company's offices were under investigation, his business partners had stopped taking his calls, and the newspapers had already turned his downfall into a national story. His name was on every screen, but for all the wrong reasons. He spent hours in his study staring at the piles of documents scattered across the desk, trying to find answers. How could everything fall apart so fast? Just a week ago, he had been the man everyone respected, the man people wanted to impress. Now his world was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He looked at the family portrait hanging on the wall, his late mother's warm smile, his father standing proud beside her. They had built the company from nothing, with hard work and faith. But he had turned it into a place of pride, greed, and arrogance. He tried to shake the thought away, blaming everyone else for what happened. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Grace was still in the house, quietly doing her work. She never said a word about what had happened to him. She moved like a shadow, cleaning rooms, preparing simple meals, caring for his frail father. Even in chaos, her calm spirit never changed. One afternoon, as he came down the stairs, he noticed her helping his father sit up in bed. The old man looked weaker than before, his hands trembling slightly. Grace was reading to him from an old book, her voice gentle and steady. For a moment, the businessman just stood there watching them. Something about that peaceful scene stirred something inside him. But then anger took over again. He didn't want to see her there, not after everything that had happened. He stormed into the room. "You think reading stories will fix anything? Don't you have something else to do?" he snapped. Grace looked up quietly but said nothing. His father looked at him, his eyes filled with disappointment. "Sit down," the old man said weakly. He hesitated, but did as told. His father's voice trembled as he spoke. "Do you remember what your mother used to say? A house built without kindness will one day stand empty." He didn't respond. He just stared at the floor. "You humiliated the one person who served this family with love," the old man continued, "and now you stand in ruins. Don't you see the connection?" The businessman clenched his fists. "So you're saying this is my fault?" His father's breathing was slow and heavy. "You lost everything because you lost yourself." Grace placed the book down gently and stepped out of the room to give them privacy. The old man looked at his son one last time. "When I'm gone, you'll understand what truly matters." That night, the old man passed away quietly in his sleep. Grace was the one who found him. She covered him with a blanket and whispered a prayer before calling for help. When the businessman heard the news, something inside him broke. For the first time in years, he cried, not out of anger or pride, but out of regret. His father's words echoed in his mind like a haunting song. After the funeral, the mansion felt heavier than ever. Grace packed her things quietly, preparing to leave. She had served the family for most of her life, and now that the old man was gone, she no longer had a reason to stay. As she was leaving, a car pulled up to the mansion. The family's lawyer stepped out, holding a folder in his hand. He looked serious but calm. "Mr. Reynolds," he said softly, "your father left something for you to read. But before that, there's something you need to know." They sat in the living room where the air felt thick with sadness. The lawyer opened the folder and began to speak. "Many years ago, when your parents were building the company, there was a woman who helped them through their hardest times. She wasn't just an employee. She was a partner in spirit. She helped your mother manage the household while your father built the business. She stayed when everyone else left. And when your mother passed, she promised her that she would never abandon this family." The businessman frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" The lawyer handed him an envelope. "It's about Grace," he froze. Grace stood quietly by the door, holding her bag, unsure whether to stay or go. The lawyer continued, "Your mother left a handwritten note years ago. It says Grace was more than a servant, she was a friend. Your mother made me promise that Grace would always have a home here, no matter what happened. That's why your father never let her go. Even when the company became successful, she was part of the reason it succeeded." The businessman slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in his mother's handwriting. Her words were simple but full of warmth. She wrote, "Grace stood by us when we had nothing. She gave her time, her care, and her loyalty when no one else believed in us. Promise me, my son, that you will always treat her with kindness, for without her, This house would never have become a home. Tears filled his eyes as he read the words again and again. Grace had been there all along, helping, serving, caring, and he had treated her as if she were beneath him. He had humiliated the very person his parents trusted most. He looked up at her, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace smiled faintly. "Your parents were good people. They treated me like family. I didn't need to tell you. I just wanted to keep my promise to look after this house until it no longer needed me." The lawyer stood. "Your father left another note for you." He handed him a small folded paper. It had only one line written on it. "Trust those who serve with heart, not those who serve for profit." He sat there in silence, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. Everything made sense now. The fall, the loss, the emptiness. It wasn't just about money. It was about values, about humanity, about respect. Grace picked up her bag and turned toward the door. "I'll be leaving now. There's a shelter downtown that needs help. I'll be working there from now on." He wanted to stop her, to apologize, to ask her to stay. But the words wouldn't come. He just stood there, watching her walk away, realizing that losing her was like losing the last piece of his parents' legacy. That night, he went to his father's room. The same room where he had shouted, where he had refused to listen. He sat on the bed and looked at the old photo albums on the table. In one of them, he found a picture of his parents with a younger Grace beside them, smiling proudly. They looked like a real family. He placed the photo on his chest, leaned back and whispered, "I'm sorry." Outside, the rain began to fall, washing the dust off the mansion's windows. It was as if the world itself was offering him a moment of cleansing, a quiet reminder that sometimes losing everything is what it takes to see what truly matters. Months passed after Grace left the mansion, and the businessman's life looked nothing like before. The grand house that once buzzed with people now stood quiet, like a museum of lost memories. The garden was overgrown, the pool empty, and the long driveway gathered dust instead of luxury cars. The empire he built with pride was gone, sold piece by piece to pay off debts. His name that once stood for power now carried shame. Every morning he would sit by the window with a cup of black coffee, staring at the world outside. There were no phone calls, no meetings, no one waiting for his signature. The silence used to feel unbearable, but over time he began to accept it. It was as if the world had forced him to stop and face himself. One day, while clearing out old boxes, he found a photo album his father had kept. Inside were pictures of the company's early days, his parents smiling proudly with workers, small celebrations, moments of teamwork and trust. On one page, he saw a young Grace standing beside his mother, holding a tray of food, smiling warmly. She looked humble, yet there was something strong in her eyes. He realized then that she had been part of their journey all along, not just a servant, but a witness to their dreams. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a feeling he couldn't shake off. He wanted to find her, not to beg, not to justify, but to say the words he should have said long ago. It took him weeks to find where she was. Finally, a local pastor told him there was a small community shelter downtown that had grown rapidly in recent months. "A woman named Grace runs it," the pastor said. "She helps anyone who walks through those doors. Single mothers, orphans, people with nowhere to go. She gives them food, shelter, and hope." That same day, he drove there in an old car he had borrowed. The shelter stood on a quiet street painted in soft colors. Children played outside with worn-out toys, their laughter filling the air. Volunteers moved around with boxes of clothes and food. It wasn't fancy, but there was warmth, something his mansion had never known. He walked through the gate, feeling nervous for the first time in years. He didn't know what to say or how she would react. When he stepped inside, he saw her near the kitchen, wearing a simple apron, handing food to a group of children. Her smile was the same, calm, kind, real. When she saw him, she didn't look shocked. She simply nodded slightly as if she had expected he would come one day. He hesitated. "I heard about this place," he said softly. "You've done something beautiful here." Grace looked around the room. "It's not about beauty," she replied. "It's about giving people a place to feel safe. That's all most of them ever wanted." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I came to say sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "Not just for what I said, but for how I saw you. I thought money made me better than everyone. I was wrong." Grace listened quietly, then said, Sometimes losing everything is the only way to learn what really matters. He smiled faintly, tears in his eyes. You were right that day. Life really has a way of humbling the proud. She handed him a plate of food and gestured toward the table. Eat. You must be tired. He sat down surrounded by people who had nothing yet looked happier than anyone he had ever known. They talked, laughed, shared stories. No one cared about who he used to be. For the first time in years, he felt human again. Over the next few weeks, he started volunteering at the shelter. At first, it was just small things. Cleaning tables, fixing broken chairs, helping unload food deliveries. The children began to like him. They called him Uncle and ran to him whenever he arrived. Grace watched quietly, never making a big deal about his presence. He found peace in the simple things, washing dishes, painting walls, listening to people's stories. Every night he would walk home with tired hands but a calm heart. The same man who once controlled millions now found joy in handing a blanket to a shivering child. One evening, as they were closing the shelter, Grace and he sat outside on a wooden bench watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and pink and the air was cool. He broke the silence. You know, I used to think peace came from having control over everything. But here I've learned it's the opposite. Peace comes from letting go, Grace smiled. Peace doesn't come from control. It comes from compassion. The moment you start caring about people, you start healing yourself. He nodded slowly. I used to own everything, but I never had peace. You had nothing, but you always carried peace. Grace looked at him gently. Peace is something no one can take from you unless you give it away. They sat quietly for a while, watching the children play. In that silence, he realized something powerful. Life had taken everything he thought mattered, only to return the one thing he truly needed, his humanity. Months turned into a year. The shelter expanded with donations from kind strangers. People who once worked for his company and even those who once criticized him started contributing. They didn't do it for him. They did it because they saw the good happening there. The businessman, now just an ordinary volunteer, no longer cared for titles or recognition. He had found meaning in helping others. Every time he served a meal or fixed a leaking roof, he felt closer to the parents he had disappointed, to the person he should have been all along. One afternoon, a group of reporters visited the shelter to cover a story about its growing success. They didn't recognize him at first. When they did, they were surprised to see the once famous tycoon wearing simple clothes, serving food to children. One reporter asked, "Why are you here after everything you lost?" He smiled and said, "Because I finally found what I was missing." The photo of that moment spread quietly across social media. Not as a scandal, but as a story of redemption. People admired the change, but he didn't care for fame anymore. What mattered was that each night when he closed his eyes, he could finally sleep in peace. One Sunday morning, as he helped unload supplies, Grace came up beside him. "The shelter received a big anonymous donation today," she said with a smile. "Enough to build a new wing for the children." He laughed softly. "That's wonderful. Maybe the world still has some kindness left." Grace looked at him. "The world always had kindness. We just have to stop letting pride blind us to it." He nodded, feeling her words sink deep into his heart. As they walked back inside, the laughter of children filled the air again. It wasn't the sound of wealth, but it was richer than anything he had ever known. Years later, the shelter became one of the most trusted community centers in the city. People came from far and wide to volunteer, inspired by the story of a man who lost everything but found his purpose again. He never reclaimed his fortune, but he gained something greater: respect, humility, and peace. On a quiet evening, he sat alone in the garden of the shelter, looking at the stars. The air was cool, and the sound of distant laughter warmed his heart. He whispered softly, "Mom, Dad, I finally understand." Behind him, Grace's voice came gently, "You did well." He turned to smile at her, and together they stood in silence, watching the sky. There were no more words needed. The past was forgiven. The pain had turned into wisdom. And in that small, humble shelter, surrounded by people who truly cared, he finally felt home.